This is American Government, Wednesday, September 30th, 2020. We're beginning our consideration of the institutions of national government, and this will take us to the end of the course. We'll start with Congress, and then we'll turn to the Electoral College, political parties, the presidency, and the judiciary. And in each of these institutions of governance, in some ways with the exception of political parties, because of course that wasn't part of the original constitutional design. As we'll see, political parties really developed in response to the way the constitutional institutions function, of course combined with the controversies that the nation has faced. But we'll essentially follow the same procedure. We'll look at the way the institutions were designed, their functions, their purpose, their intentions. Then second, with each institution, we'll look at the way that they've changed historically, how they're different from the way they were designed, and even with the party system, how it's evolved over time. And then third, or I think I say on the note C, we'll look at the current controversies, questions, and criticisms that people make of the institutions. Part of my intention in this course is not only to introduce students to the fundamentals of American government, founding, the principles of the Declaration, and the way our institutions have evolved. I also think that thoughtful citizens should be able to criticize or understand the criticisms, not only of the particular institutions which we'll be considering, but also, for that matter, even of the American political system as a whole. So that will be our procedure, and of course we're starting with Congress. Now, I have to say that it's interesting. I also teach an upper level course on Congress, as I do on the presidency and constitutional law, etc. And I think that one of the most interesting things about Congress is how unpopular it is. As I explained in the notes, since about World War II, and by the way, this is because this is also true with polling, for instance, which really took off after World War II, but also approval ratings and that kind of issue. Now, part of that has to do with the development of social science and statistical methods, but also the rise of computers and the ability to compute lots of data. So these kinds of, so not only polling, which is actually poses some interesting questions that we'll talk about when we come back to elections and political parties, but approval ratings have become kind of a part of the fabric of commentary on American government. And as you might have suspected, the approval rating of presidents, of the presidency, tends to vary with each president and with each issue, by the way. It's an interesting thing that the president, since approval ratings have been, of the presidency and other institutions have been taken since about the end of World War II, the president who had the highest approval rating also had the lowest approval rating. That was George Bush II, who after the 9/11 had a 93% approval rating in most measures. But then after the Second Gulf War began to mount in casualties and cost, and before the surge in 2006, he and also, by the way, don't forget, we also had a terrible economic crisis during his presidency, the Great Recession that began in 2007, 2008. His popularity or approval dropped to 23%. So again, most presidents, by the way, and this is true of all the presidents since World War II, since modern times, President Obama and President Trump for that matter, most presidential approval ratings hover somewhere between the upper 30s and the upper 40s, or somewhere between 40 and 50%. It's very unusual for a president to end his term or her term with as high or higher approval rating at the end than at the beginning. So it's also true that other institutions in American life, the pastorate, for instance, tends to be rated fairly high. But also in terms of institutions of American government, the Supreme Court has been pretty consistent in the approval of the American people. It tends to be between 50 to 60%. It's Congress that has declined rapidly and remarkably. At the end of World War II, probably about 50 to 60% of people approved of Congress as an institution, but then that's been steadily declining. And now, in the last 10 years or so, Congress's approval rating has dropped to sometimes as low as 8%, 9%, 10%. It's actually tends to be lower than even used car salesmen. So that shows that the American people really have rather a low opinion of their institution. Now, let me note one thing, that that even though Congress as an institution has declined in approval, um, uh, it's true that Americans tend to rate their local representative in the House of Representatives or their senator fairly high. In fact, one of the things we'll explore on Friday is the rise in incumbency. So there is an interesting irony here. Americans tend to disapprove of Congress, but they tend to approve of their local representative or senator. Why that is, and in fact, why there might be different explanations as to the low approval rating of Congress, we'll examine that actually on Friday and on Monday. So, you could say that most Americans don't think that Congress works as an institution, that it's dysfunctional, that it's not living up to its constitutional purposes. So, we'll use that question to guide our consideration of Congress. As I said, first we'll look at the original intentions, and I'll open them up in a minute. And then we'll look at the way that Congress has developed historically. And then on Monday, we'll look at the question of the criticisms made of Congress. And in some ways, you'd have to say that most Americans think that Congress probably needs some kind of reform. And we'll end this consideration of this part of the course with what kind of reform that people think. And so whether Congress needs reform and what kind of reform Congress might need. So with that in mind, let's open up our consideration by thinking about the framers' design. Now, and as I suggested, and we just last week, or the week before, I should say, we had an intensive examination of the Constitution, and as I mentioned, that with each branch of Article 1, 2, and 3, where you have the vesting clause that vests the essential power, the legislative power, the executive power, the judicial power, I should say all legislative powers in Article 1, Section 1. You also learn not only what the nature of the essential power of that branch is, you also learn some minimal structural information. As I pointed out in our consideration of Article 1, you learn that Congress, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress to consist of a House and Senate. So you learn in the vesting clause in Article 1, Section 1, that Congress is bicameral. You learn in Article 2, Section 1, that the President consists of a single person. You learn in Article 3, Section 1, that the judiciary is hierarchical, one Supreme Court and such inferior courts, etc. So let's begin our consideration of the founders' intentions with respect to Congress and its bicameral character by meditating on the nature of a good law. I want to suggest that perhaps when you consider what the nature of a good law is, that points perhaps in the direction of bicameralism. So I would suggest that a good law has two essential characteristics. It has to have content. It has to address a real public need, a real issue of the common good. So it has to be based on knowledge, and it has to be deliberative, and it has to be formulated in a way that really addresses some important issue of the public good. But laws also have to have what I would call, and I just made this word up, obeyability. It's I want to give two examples of laws that might have had and do have good public content, but the problem was that nobody obeyed them, and many people don't obey them. One is prohibition. Um, Again, remember that the 19th Amendment, which gave women the vote, came into being partially because the Women's Christian Temperance Union was the most active women's organization after the Civil War up through the 19th Amendment. In some ways, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the general movement towards prohibition, which led to the 18th Amendment and the prohibiting of the manufacture and sale of alcohol within the United States. Now, was that a good idea? Why was this such an issue? Why did it bring so many women into politics and political involvement? Because alcoholism was a real problem among the working classes and among the West. So in some ways, you could say that widespread alcoholism led to agitation to kind of cure the problem of alcohol addiction in the United States. So you could say, would the United States have been better off not having alcohol um, uh, available, and so probably, perhaps, yes. I don't want to actually defend the issue because I'm not, there are many different opinions of this and any other kind of prohibited substances. All I mean to say is you could say there was a real health issue, there was a real public issue, and it seemed to at least a significant portion of the country. Don't forget how difficult the amendment process is that alcohol probably would we'd be better off without alcohol. The problem is once it was passed, nobody obeyed it. And the contemporary example of that I want to give is in some ways is speeding laws. I live in Charlotte and I commute to Spartanburg. And in some ways, I am astounded. The posted speed limit in on I-85 from Charlotte to Spartanburg is mostly actually because of construction. It goes all the way from 65, some places 70, to 55. And I am astounded by the fact that everybody, I'm not saying necessarily myself, but everybody seems to be going 80 miles an hour. Now, it's true. I've seen the police stopping people for going probably 90 or 100 or something like that. But here's my point: speeding laws, I think everyone would admit, probably have some usefulness and are a good thing. Nobody wants to see cars going 90 miles an hour down downtown Spartanburg. Um, but but the problem, if nobody's obeying the law, and this goes both with respect to prohibition and etc., is it makes a mockery of the law if nobody's obeying it. And so, in some ways, it undermines the rule of law. It undermines the respect for law that probably all free societies have to rest upon. And so, I would say that these two components of a law, that it has to address some real public issue, but that it actually has to really be obeyed, um, points to bicameralism. And because obeyability, of course, as you're going to see, is most embodied in the function of representation, and then of course the other component of law, its content or its genuine addressing a public need or a public good, um, has to do with deliberation and real consideration and knowledge and other aspects of the public good. So, as we'll see, this bicameralism is exactly how the framers designed the Congress. So what we'll do is we'll look at the intentions for the House of Representatives and the Senate as revealed in the Federalist Papers, essentially. And like many of the Federalist Papers, not all, but many of them, the arguments presented in the Federalist Papers are responses to the criticisms made of the proposed institutions and 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 uh, and the overall constitutional system. Um, so when it comes to the House of Representatives and the Senate, you'll see Anti-Federalists, the critics of the Constitution, argued that these institutions were defective for really quite different reasons. As we'll see, nobody contested that there should be an institution like the House of Representatives. The main arguments against the House made by the Anti-Federalists, as we'll see, was that the House would fail to embody that function, that the House of Representatives would not really be representative. When it came to the Senate, and it's important to remember that as you know, that the Articles of Confederation Congress was a unicameral Congress, a single House chamber, and that two of the states, Pennsylvania and Georgia at the time, had unicameral legislatures. Many of the legislatures in the world are unicameral. Israel has a unicameral legislature, and several of the states have unicameral legislatures. But generally speaking, the argument against the Senate was that you don't need that second chamber. It's a reduplication. It's a duplication of time and money and effort. And also, it's harder, as we saw in Sentinel, by the way, who also advocated a simple unicameral legislature, because of the difficulty of following the legislative process in both chambers. It is more difficult for people to understand. And you'll see when we turn on Friday to the historical changes in the House and Senate, when you add internal structures like the committee system and the party structure, it's even harder for the public to really follow the legislative process. So there are disadvantages to having a second legislative chamber. So generally speaking, the criticism of the Senate was you don't need a Senate, or nothing justifies the duplication of time, money, and effort and obscurity that comes from a second legislative chamber. So let's turn to the House of Representatives. Generally speaking, the Anti-Federalists argued, and we'll see this by looking at several of the quotes from the Nichols Reader, and by the way, the Nichols Readers are, if you remember my outline of the Federalist Papers from a couple of weeks ago, after Federalist 47 to 51 presents the general theory of the structure of the institutions of the Constitution, separation of powers and checks and balances, and then the rest of the Federalist Papers just turn to the various institutions of the national government, 52 through 66. 52 through 59, the House, 60 through 66, the Senate, 67 through 77, the Presidency, 78 through 83, the Judiciary, 84, the Bill of Rights, and then 85, the concluding essay. So the Nichols Reader, the selections are taken from, on the House of Representatives, are taken from 52, etc., through 59, and then from the Senate are taken 60 through 66. So what were the primary criticisms made of the House of Representatives? Why did the Anti-Federalists argue that the House of Representatives would not embody the representative function? They tend to make three arguments. One, that the term of the members of the House was too long. As you'll see on the notes, I quote from Federalist 53, and this is a little bit clearer. Let me just quote from Madison. I shall here perhaps be reminded of the current observation that where annual elections begin, tyranny begins, and so forth. You can read the rest of the quote in the notes. Generally speaking, the Anti-Federalists argued that the term of the House, and which is 2 years, by the way, should be shorter, which should be 1 year. So in a way, looking at, and then Madison actually looks at several of the states, and there was a variety of alternatives. But you could say this: the Congress creates a powerful national government. It creates a powerful Congress. And therefore, when it came to the representative function, the Anti-Federalists were arguing that that 1 year would be essential in terms of keeping the House of Representatives connected with the people. The second argument was that the body would be too small. And if you think about it, what that means is you could say is the number of the representatives would not be large enough to represent the diversity of the nation. Or another way of looking at it would be this: there's obviously an inverse relationship between the size of a district, that the number that a representative represents, and the number of representatives in the House. In other words, if we, for instance, follow the original rule of representation, which is 1 for every 30,000, we would have 10,000 members of the House of Representatives. Now keep that in mind, because that has something to do with Madison's response to this. As it is now, we have about 800,000 to about 1 million or so representatives per representative district. So it's clear if you increase the number of representatives in the chamber, you'll shrink the number of people who are represented in each district. And the argument is that, well, representatives have to know the interest of their people, and that therefore, if they're representing a smaller number of people in their district, they'll have a better grasp of the representation, and that their constituents will know them better. So the second argument is that the House is too small to really be representative, represent the diversity of the nation, etc. And the third argument is that over time, perhaps immediately, the House would represent an elite body of individuals that would not look like the American people. In some ways, this concept is called virtual representation, that a representative body should contain the same divisions and elements in society in the chamber itself that are represented in society. Now, when you read Chapter 9 from Wilson, you'll see that in many ways today's Congress does look more like the American people than the original Congress did. But as you're going to see, that was the third criticism, that the House won't look like the American people. It'll be an elite class that'll eventually become separated from and not be representative of the American people. So what's Madison's way of responding to these three charges? In a way, if you think about it, the essential charge is that the House will fail to embody the function of representation. So if you think about it in a debate, if you're debating whether or not the House is going to be representative, what would be logically necessary for you to do? You'd have to establish what representation is. if you can say what representation is, then you can measure the House and see if it embodies that function. And Madison does that like a good debater. So if you're following, this is actually from page 164, from the opening of the selections that the Nichols present with respect to the House. And what I'm going to do is read the paragraph originally from Federalist 52, and then I'm going to translate it by rearranging the terms and finding a synonym for the key terms. So what is representation? This is Madison. As it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration, the House of Representatives, should have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. So, what's the definition of representation that emerges from this? By immediate dependence, Madison means by those terms direct election. That is to say, the members are in their office by virtue of being directly elected by the people. So immediate dependence really means direct election. Intimate sympathy really means that the representatives should understand the passions, interests, and opinions of the people they represent. So in some ways, he's really saying that the essence of representation is an intimate sympathy that is that's the end or the purpose that's created by the means of direct election or immediate dependence. So representativeness, representation is a sympathy with the opinions, passions, and interests of the people, as he explains in some paragraphs later on, that comes from direct election. So with that in mind, Madison suggests with respect to each of the three arguments. One, that it's true. Obviously, it's true that more frequent elections means that the representatives will be more connected with changes in opinions and interests of the people they represent. It's like, if you will, sampling the water in a river. If you take a water sample in a river, the more frequently you take the sample, the more your sample will reflect the actual character of the flow of the river. So in some ways, he doesn't dispute this. And of course, when you look at the term of the House, which is 2 years, versus the term of the Senate, clearly the framers also accepted the principle that frequent elections are necessary to generate representativeness. Madison doesn't dispute that principle, that frequent elections make a body more representative. What he does is try to balance it with another principle, knowledgeability, that representatives have to know their job. They have to know what they're talking about. They have to know aspects of the public good. And therefore, you could have a term that was 6 months. You could have a term that was a year. But the problem that Madison says is you'll probably lose, either because of the constant changeover or because of the shortness of the term. Representatives really won't be able to deliberate on what the law should be, that content dimension of a law, because they're there for such a short time. So his response is not to dispute the principle of frequent elections, but to balance it with the other considerations that a legislator needs, knowledge and stability. The second charge, that the House will be too small. Again, obviously the framers thought that a larger body, a larger chamber, would be more representative of the diversity of the American people. Originally, they simply guessed in the first House of Representatives, before the first census, which is taken every 10 years to measure the change and shifts in the American people, they simply guessed 65 people. And of course, the Senate, with 13 states, 2 senators, there were 26 senators. So roughly speaking, you'd have to say, and today there are 435 members of the House. At the turn of the century, that number was set because, as you're going to see, because of the second consideration that Madison makes. And the Senate has 100. So roughly the House has always been about 4 times the size of the Senate. So again, in this second principle, Madison doesn't dispute that a larger body will be more reflective. It's like pixels and megapixels. The more pixels, the accurate the representation. What he does, again, in the second argument is to balance it with another consideration. You could have 10,000 representatives, as you would have if we had the original rule of representation, but it'd be a chaos. It'd be a mob. You'd lose the capacity for coherent deliberation. So as Madison points out in the second argument, it's not that a larger chamber wouldn't be more representative, but the limit is is there has to be a small enough number to enable genuine deliberation and thinking about the nature of the law. So large enough to be more representative, but not so large that it becomes incoherent, irrational, and a mob. On the third argument, Madison really does dispute the principle. He argues that a virtual representation, an actual mirror of society, is impossible in a representative body, and that, and as you'll see, in some ways, he says, well, you can't simply say that it's going to consist of a certain number of religious people, a certain or gender or something like that, or even professions. You just can't do that. So instead of trying this false idea of a virtual representation, a mirror image of the society, rather, in order to generate that representativeness of the intimate sympathy through due dependence, through immediate dependence, rather make sure that that the self-interest of the legislator, which of course is election and re-election, and as we'll see, this actually is the primary motive of most people in Congress, is to be re-elected. If you can channel that energy into serving their constituents, you'll generate that term. And the bottom of 166 in the Nichols Reader, here's how he says it. Such will be the relation between the House of Representatives and their constituents. Duty, gratitude, interest, and ambition itself are the cords by which they are bound to fidelity and sympathy with the great mass of the people. So, as you'll see, the argument is the House has frequent enough elections to be more representative, but long enough to be deliberative and knowledgeable. The size is more representative, but not so large that the House becomes incoherent and irrational. And that the mirror image of the American people is not the desideratum, it's not the thing to be desired, but rather a fidelity to the interests, opinions, and passions of the people. And Madison argues is that the electoral mechanism, the direct electoral mechanism, is enough to do that in the House. Now, with respect to the arguments for the Senate, again, as I said, here the argument's different. The Anti-Federalists are arguing you don't need a Senate. It's for reasons that we mentioned above. So as you're going to see, there's a kind of an irony in the way these arguments are structured. Madison originally, and then Hamilton takes over the argument, argues that you need a Senate to correct 6 deficiencies or defects that you would have in the legislative process if you didn't have a Senate. So in some ways, what I've done rhetorically is, and you'll see that in pages 168 through 170, etc., when he goes first, secondly, thirdly, fourthly, and then on page 170, a fifth desideratum, and then on page 171, a sixth defect or want. Again, he kind of goes back and forth between the defects that a Senate will correct versus the positive qualities that a Senate supplies. So what I want to do is actually keep essentially to the positive side, and say what his argument for the Senate is. Now, you'll see that the first 2 arguments on page 168 and 168-9 are really simple arguments for bicameralism. Let me read what he says, and then I'll state the 2 arguments. First, it is a misfortune incident to Republican government, though in a less degree than to other governments, that those who administer it may forget their obligations to their constituents and prove unfaithful to their important trust. In this point of view, a Senate, as a second branch of the Legislative Assembly, distinct from and dividing the power with a first, must in all cases be a salutary, assuming you may not have run to the dictionary when you encounter the word salutary. It comes from the word to be healthy. So salutary means healthy. Check on the government. It doubles the security to the people by requiring the concurrence of 2 distinct bodies in schemes of usurpation, that's corruption, or perfidy, which is illegality or immorality, where the ambition or corruption of one would otherwise be sufficient. So he's saying that that if you just doubled the legislative chamber, if you just had two houses of representatives, identical bodies, but at least two of them, it would be more of a check against corruption. And this is not simply abstract, by the way. In the 1790s, the single house legislature of Georgia, there was a famous court case which actually upheld the legislative action, as we'll see, the sanctity of contracts, because of Article 1, Section 10, that says states can't deny the obligation of contract. In the early 1790s, an unscrupulous land dealer bribed the Georgia legislature, which was unicameral, to sell him massive tracts of land at a below market rate, which then he subsequently sold to other developers. When it became clear that the legislature had been bribed, that legislature was by and large voted out of office, and the new legislature repudiated the original sale. Now, the Supreme Court actually upheld the sale on the grounds that it was a contract. But my point here is that the idea that you can corrupt a single legislative body, and that if you double the chamber, that simply the fact that you have two chambers to corrupt reduces the likelihood of corruption, that wasn't simply an abstract possibility. So that's the first argument. Two chambers it's harder to corrupt government by schemes of, as he says, usurpation and perfidy, by corrupt schemes. Now, second, here's the second defect or that a Senate corrects, or the positive that it provides. Second, the necessity of a Senate, and this is on the bottom of 168. The necessity of a Senate is no less indicated by the propensity of all single and numerous assemblies to yield to the impulse of sudden and violent passions, and to be seduced by factious leaders into intemperate and pernicious resolutions. All that need be remarked is that a body which is to correct this infirmity must be free from it, and be, etc. So, on one level, as you're going to see, this has to do with the framers' embrace of, but a cautious embrace of, democratic public opinion as the basis of policy. People change their mind rapidly, and the things that people think are important 1 month may, after all, think of what people thought were important 1 month before March in 2020, before the pandemic broke out. And in some ways, what the public mind thinks is important can change very rapidly. Oftentimes it's unknowledgeable. It moves to misimpressions, and especially we've seen that the media can have a powerful effect on people's passions and partisan opinions. So in some ways, his simple point is, if you double the chamber and force legislation to go first through one body and then another body, it will be more reflective. The possibility of being carried away by inappropriate public opinion or unthoughtful public passion will be lessened by a two-chamber legislature. Now, the last four have more to do with the unique nature of the Senate. So, as you're going to see, these four qualities of more knowledgeability, more stability, more national outlook, and more of a personal sense in the involvement in policy have to do with the things that the designer of a constitution can actually manipulate. These structural features that when we talked initially about the Constitution, what's a structural feature of an institution? Well, things like size, number, term, qualifications, and mode of election. So what's different from the Senate that makes it a different body with respect to more of these desirable qualities is, of course, things like size. We already mentioned the Senate tends to be generally 1/4 the size of the House. It's a smaller body. And we'll see that in the modern Senate, and this has always been the case, even today with the extreme partisanship of our politics, the personal relationships of the Senate tend to create a different dynamic, a different legislative dynamic. So the fact that the House, the Senate is smaller, substantially smaller, by the way. Second, that the terms are longer. Senators are elected for 6 years, and members of the House. In today's electoral environment, that means members of the House are always running for election. All students of Congress have admitted that the moment that a person gets elected to the House, they are already planning their reelection. scholars have noted that the 6-year term of senators gives them something of a slightly larger distance from public opinion. And therefore, there's a kind of a pattern where senators get into governing, and then towards the middle 2 terms of their 6-year term, they start to pay more attention. In the last two terms, their attention to reelection goes up. But there is a certain sense in which the 6-year term of senators really does create a kind of a greater freedom from the simple pressures of public opinion. The House is more responsive to public opinion, the Senate somewhat less so. And by the way, don't forget, in the original Senate, only 1/3 of the Senate was elected. The first Senate that was divided into 3 classes, one with a 2-year term, a 4-year term, and then a 6-year term, so that the body of the Senate, the whole Senate, wouldn't go up for election all at one time. The entire House, all 435 members, goes up for election every 2 years. So even Nancy Pelosi has to go stand election every 2 years, even if she comes from, as we'll see in Chapter 9 was discussed, as a marginal or a safe or a safe district. So, but in the Senate, it's staggered, and of course, once the 6-year term of the original Senate was fulfilled, all senators serve a 6-year term, but only 1/3 of the Senate is elected. So the Senate is a more continuous body. It has more of an institutional memory. Don't forget also that that senators have slightly higher qualifications. Now, you have to admit, it's not a great difference. It's not a different kind of human being to say 25 years old for the House and 30 years for the Senate, 7 years a citizen for members of the House, and 9 years. Those aren't remarkable differences, but you could say the Senate requires you to be a little more experienced, a little older, and a little more involved in American issues by requiring 9 years of citizenship versus 7 years of citizenship. And of course, you have to be representative of the state that you represent for both the House and the Senate. But don't forget, there was another issue in the original Senate, too. And this is what the 17th Amendment changed. Remember that the original Senate was elected by state legislatures. Don't forget that in the original Constitution, the only part of the national government that was directly elected, this immediate sympathy through this intimate sympathy through immediate dependence that Madison says is representation, only one institution was directly elected by the people, the House. Now, it's true, in each state, the people elect their state legislatures, but it was the state legislatures who elected the Senate. And then, as today, the American people do not vote for president. We vote for electors who then vote for president. And of course, the Supreme Court is appointed, as you know from today's news, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. So in some ways, when you look at all the differences between the Senate, smaller, longer term, staggered so that it's continuous, higher qualifications, and indirect election, the framers thought that, generally speaking, the Senate would be a profoundly different kind of body, not a totally different body, not like the House of Lords in the British Constitution, which is unelected and hereditary, versus the House of Commons, but different modes of the same kind of essentially American human being. So, so why would it be more knowledgeable? Because they're there long. Why would it be more stable? Because, of course, they have a longer term, as we already talked about that. The fifth desideratum, the fifth positive good, that they have a more national outlook. And this is true today, by the way. More Americans know more senators in the Senate than they tend to know of representatives in their own state. I found this out many years teaching American government in South Carolina. Not only do most college students know the 2 senators of South Carolina, they tend to know who more senators are, because senators are a more national body. Since they come from the whole state, they're less tied to local interests. And therefore, and you'll see that's also why the framers gave the 2 unique powers of the Senate, the ability to ratify treaties with a 2/3 vote, and also to ratify executive and judicial appointments. They thought that because they would be drawn from a larger constituency of the whole state rather than a small legislative district, and in some cases like California, where you have 52 representatives versus 2 senators, that's a pretty substantial difference in terms of the size of the district, that representatives. Now, in a state like Wyoming, which only has 1 representative, you could say the same district is the same for the senators. But generally speaking, senators come from a larger district, a state, and therefore they are freer from local interest and pay more attention to national interest. And you'd have to say that indirect election would mean, now of course, as we'll see on Friday when we look at historical changes in the Congress, direct election of the senators did change the nature of the Senate, we'll see. And but nevertheless, you'd have to say that because there are fewer senators, if you look at responsibility for national policy as a pie, each person in the House, with the exception of leadership of committees and the party leadership, the pie of policy making is divided by 1 over 435. In the Senate, it's divided by 1 over 100. That means each senator, and as we'll see, this also bears in the way the committee system is different between the two chambers, each senator has a greater effect on national policy, and therefore you could say has more of a personal sense of responsibility. That's Hamilton's point. So there you have it, the bicameral design of the original Congress. Rooted through the House of Representatives into the more local and changing interests and passions of the people, public opinion, but with a 2-year term so that they know what they're doing, balanced by the Senate, smaller, more deliberative, stable, and more knowledgeable. And as you'll see, it's that bicameral design, that certain amount of representation with a certain amount of deliberation, which the framers hoped to achieve in the Congress. And on Friday, we'll examine how that design has changed with important changes in both houses and in the Congress as a whole. And on Monday, we'll raise the question of whether or not the Congress still adheres to that original design, or whether or not it's, as the American people believe, it's dysfunctional and needs reform.